8 and 9. Improvements 24 and 25. Landlord and tenant improvements are common items for extensive negotiation. Think of the work schedule when establishing times. Consider it if the landlord and the tenant work will overlap. 8. Landlord improvements 24. If the tenant is accepting the premises as is, check none. Otherwise, attach a schedule. Schedule 8.1. 9. Tenant improvements 25A. Enter the date the tenant viewed the premises in paragraph 9.1. B. Use a schedule, schedule 9.2, to describe the work the tenant will do. 10. Lease. Read the lease. 26. The lease. The lease for the premises. The lease shall be the landlord's standard form of lease for the premises. A copy of the lease is attached as schedule 10.1, or if not attached, a copy of the lease shall be delivered to the tenant within the time specified in Section 10.2 following acceptance of this offer. The lease shall be modified to include the provisions of this offer in either event. The tenant shall have the time specified in Section 10.3 after receipt of the lease to review and approve of the lease. Upon completion of the tenant's review and approval, the landlord shall prepare and deliver the lease to the tenant for execution. The tenant shall execute the lease and shall cause any covenanter to execute the lease, and shall deliver the lease to the landlord forthwith upon receipt of the same, and in any event prior to taking possession of and commencing business operations from the premises. If the tenant takes possession of the premises without executing the lease, the tenant shall be deemed to have executed the lease and shall be bound by all of the provisions thereof, provided, however, the tenant shall remain obligated to execute and deliver the lease to the landlord forthwith upon demand, and such failure to execute and deliver the lease to the landlord shall constitute a default under the terms of the lease. The landlord shall not be obliged to deliver the lease to the tenant in a form acceptable for registration. 10. Lease 26. A. Section 26 assumes the landlord has a standard lease agreement. The licensee must ensure that a standard lease agreement is available, or that a lease will be drafted, and at whose expense. B. Section 26 requires the tenant and covenantor, if any, to have executed the lease prior to taking possession. C. If the tenant takes possession without executing the lease, clause 26 deems the tenant to have executed the lease. D. Section 26 specifically excuses the landlord from preparing the lease in registrable form. If the parties require that the lease be registrable, ensure that the cost is assigned as the parties negotiate. E. However, it is the licensee's responsibility to ensure that all of the business terms of the agreement are contained in the offer to lease. 10.1. Lease attached, check appropriate box. 10.2. Provision of lease. Usually 10 business days are adequate. 10.3. Review approval. Usually the parties' lawyers review the offer to lease and negotiate the details. However, it is the licensee's responsibility to ensure that all of the business terms of the agreement are contained in the offer to lease. 11. Option to renew. An option to renew benefits the tenant. It does little or nothing for the landlord. 27. Option to renew, provided the tenant duly and regularly pays the rent plus GST and has not been in breach of any of the terms, conditions, and covenants contained in the lease. The tenant shall have the option to renew the lease for a further term specified in Section 11.1, the renewal term on the same terms and conditions as the initial term, except for basic rent, any free rent allowance, fixturing period, any other tenant inducements or allowances, and this option to renew The rental for the renewable term shall be based on the prevailing fair market rental for improved premises of similar size, quality, use, and location as agreed between the parties, and failing such agreement as determined by arbitration pursuant to the Arbitration Act. The tenant shall give written notice of the tenant's intent to exercise such option to renew to the landlord no later than the time specified in section 11.2 prior to the date of expiry of the initial term, failing which such option shall be null and void and incapable of exercise. Section 12, topic is tenants' conditions precedent. Reference section 32, tenants' conditions precedent. This offer and its acceptance is subject to the conditions precedent set out in Schedule 12.1, all of which are for the sole benefit of the tenant's conditions. The tenant's conditions shall be removed or waived by notice in writing from the tenant to the landlord on or before the time specified in Schedule 12.1, or the agreement resulting from the acceptance of this offer shall become null and void and of no force or effect, and the deposit shall be returned to the tenant. The landlord and tenant specifically confirm that this offer is executed under seal. It is agreed and understood that the landlord's acceptance is subject to the landlord's conditions described in section 33, if any, irrevocable, including without limitation during the period for the tenant to either fulfill or waive the tenant's conditions. 12.1 Tenants' Conditions Precedent, section 32, zoning and availability. To obtain a business license should always be tenants' conditions. Review of landlord's standard form of lease. So we've got section 13, landlord's conditions precedent, reference 33. So 33, landlord's conditions precedent. This offer and its acceptance is subject to the conditions precedent set out in Schedule 13.1. all of which are for the sole benefit of the landlord's conditions. The landlord's conditions shall be removed or waived by notice in writing from the landlord to the tenant on or before the time specified in Schedule 13.1, or the agreement resulting from the acceptance of this offer shall become null and void and of no force or effect, and the deposit shall be returned to the tenant. The landlord and tenant specifically confirm that this offer is executed under seal. It is agreed and understood that this offer is subject to the tenant's conditions described in section 32, if any, irrevocable, including without limitation during the period for the landlord to either fulfill or waive the landlord's conditions. 13.1 Landlord's Conditions Precedent. 33 Approving the tenant's credit worthiness should always be a landlord's condition. 14 Deposits split between what is prepaid and what is actually a security deposit. 34 Deposit within the time specified in section 14.1 of this offer by the landlord. The tenant shall deliver a check in the amount specified in section 14.2, payable to the party specified in section 14.3 in trust as a deposit to be applied to the first month's gross rent. The balance of the deposit shall be held as a security deposit against payment and proper performance by the tenant of the tenant's obligations under the lease, including payment of rent. If the tenant defaults in carrying out any of its obligations hereunder, the landlord, at its option, may retain the deposit as liquidated damages and not as a penalty without limiting the landlord's other remedies at law or in equity. If this offer becomes null and void, the deposit shall be refunded to the tenant without deduction. Upon the date set for occupancy or upon execution of the lease, whichever occurs first, the rent is then due and payable and may be deducted from the deposit with any remaining balance to be paid forthwith. This deposit shall not bear interest. The deposit is to be held in trust by the party specified as a stakeholder pursuant to the provisions of the Real Estate Services Act and not on behalf of the principals to the transaction until the time specified below. The landlord and tenant hereby instruct the party holding the deposit to release the deposit upon the earlier of A, the date on which the lease is submitted to the Land Title Office for registration, B, the date the tenant has the right to take possession of the premises, and C, the date the tenant lawfully occupies the premises. 14.1 Date for deposit. 34. Complete appropriate box. 14.2 Amount. A. Negotiated between the parties. B. The tenant's credit worthiness should be considered. 14.3 Deposit holder. 34. A. Enter the name of the deposit holder. B. If required, obtain agreements required by Section 27.4 of the Real Estate Services Act. Alright, and then C, note the deposit holder is acting as a stakeholder. 15, Agency Agreement. 36, acknowledges agency relationships and having received, read, and understood the Working with a Realtor brochure as with other BCREA standard forms and contracts. 16, Offer. 39 offer. This offer or counteroffer will be open for acceptance until the time and date specified in Section 16.1, unless withdrawn in writing with notification to the other party of such revocation prior to notification of its acceptance, and upon acceptance of the offer or counteroffer by accepting in writing and notifying the other party of such acceptance, there will be a binding offer to lease on the terms and conditions set forth. 16.1 Date time. 39 Set out realistic times. 17 Schedules. Check the appropriate boxes. 28 Assignment. 28 Only with landlord's written consent. 28 Assignment. The tenant shall not assign all or any of its rights or obligations under this offer except with the prior written consent of the landlord. 31 Contaminated sites. Pursuant to the Environmental Management Act, the Contaminated Sites Regulation, the landlord shall be responsible for pre-existing contamination on the premises, if any, at the time the tenant takes possession. The tenant shall be responsible for any contamination of the premises related to or as a result of the use and occupation of the premises by the tenant, or any act or omission of the tenant or any person for whom it is in law responsible, and shall indemnify the landlord with respect thereto. The tenant shall not contaminate the premises or otherwise contravene the Environmental Management Act as amended, or any other statutes, laws, regulations, orders, bylaws, standards, guidelines, permits, and other lawful requirements of any government authority having jurisdiction over the premises. 35. Interpretation. Note the last sentence of this section. Emphasis added. So 35. Interpretation. Time shall be of the essence in all matters to be performed by each party to this offer. This offer, if accepted, shall constitute a binding agreement between the parties to enter into the lease and to abide by the terms and conditions contained herein. If there are two or more tenants hereunder, the liability of such tenants shall be joint and several. There are no representations, warranties, guarantees, promises, or agreements other than those set out herein, all of which shall survive the signing of the lease. Whenever the context so requires, the neuter gender shall include masculine and feminine, and the singular number shall include the plural, and vice versa. This offer shall be governed by the laws of the province of British Columbia. This offer shall endure to the benefit of and be binding upon the successors and permitted assigns of the parties. Okay, now here's the important one. It's underlined and it's bolded. If there is a contradiction between the provisions of this offer and the terms and conditions of the lease, the offer shall prevail. You get that? The offer shall prevail. 38. Information summary. Note the parties are acknowledging they have read the whole offer, including Part 1, Part 2, and any schedules. So 38. Information summary. The information summary being Part 1, this offer, and the schedules attached to this offer form an integral part of this offer. The landlord and tenant acknowledge that they have read all of Part 1 and Part 2 and the schedules to this offer. 40. Acceptance. Leave adequate time business days. Okay? 40. Acceptance. The landlord A hereby accepts the above offer and agrees to complete the lease upon the terms and conditions set out above. B agrees to pay a commission as per the authority to lease. Neither the preparation by the landlord of this or any form of offer, nor any negotiations entered into by the landlord in connection with this submission shall constitute or imply any commitment unless the above offer has been accepted in writing by the landlord. All right, and that's it for now. Thanks.